The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is really a major victory of the Indigenous Peoples movement. The declaration is a response to all the pleas, the appeals, the cries that Indigenous peoples have brought before the United Nations. No, and secondly, the declaration also is not a declaration. It's not an instrument that establishes new rights. It actually just interprets the existing international rights instruments as far as it applies to indigenous peoples. Because indigenous peoples have a unique historical circumstance in terms of colonization, in terms of discrimination, and therefore the declaration interprets what the international human rights contain insofar as it applies to indigenous peoples. Well, you can use the declaration number one to raise the awareness of the world about indigenous peoples' issues and indigenous peoples' rights. Secondly, you can use the declaration to further strengthen the assertion of the rights of indigenous people. So when we say that we have our lands are being taken away from us because of a hydroelectric dam, then we can say that the declaration says that our free, prior, and informed consent has to be obtained before you bring in any project in our community or before you relocate us from this community. So it will really give tools to indigenous peoples to strengthen rights that they think are inherently theirs. Thirdly, you can use the declaration as an educational tool, in schools, in the media, in the community to really empower further the indigenous peoples, because in many countries, indigenous peoples feel that they even don't have rights, that when the government comes and says, oh, you have to leave this place because we are going to build a dam, then some indigenous peoples don't think that they have the right to complain against it. Of course, some indigenous peoples will fight very strongly against it, but with the declaration, they will have an additional tool. Well, the next thing that's going to happen in the permanent forum, we are mandated now to implement the declaration. No, so that's the next big thing. How do we do that? No, that means, of course, that we need to really encourage UN agencies, number one, to use the declaration as the main framework for the projects, programs, and policies that they have relevant to indigenous peoples. But we also have to get the governments, to implement the declaration because they are the ones who are mainly addressed by the declaration, and so it will be a good thing if we are able to bring the governments to make a report on how they are implementing the declaration. I mean, there are now processes where the constitutions are being changed, like Bolivia already adopted the declaration as its national law. There are also governments who will be more pressured to at least develop a law on indigenous peoples. But the other thing is also like there are all these multilateral agencies like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, who have their own policies on indigenous peoples. They can use the declaration also to strengthen further these policies, and indigenous peoples can keep uh, pressuring the World Bank to adhere to the standards set by the declaration. So I think that's what's going to happen more and more because of course the awareness of indigenous peoples about the existence of the declaration is going to be greater, and now indigenous peoples are translating the declaration in their own languages, so the dissemination of the contents of the declaration is a very crucial activity because that will really make indigenous peoples understand better what is this instrument and how they can use it. The most important challenge still remains the implementation, no? As you know, the declaration really contains rights and articles which goes against the very grain of what governments are doing. Isn't it? Like it says that you have the right to your lands, territories, and resources. Many governments don't like to recognize that. Specifically, governments don't like to recognize subsurface resources like gold or oil or gas. They would like to assert that these are owned by the state. Water, for instance, governments say that the state owns the water resources, but indigenous people say no. So these kinds of articles will really be the most difficult ones that will be implemented. But I mean, that's how life is. I mean, you don't get everything that you want, but because that's really morally and legally recognized already, then you just have to keep on fighting for it.